Welcome back. Let's now talk about functions of receptors. Now, receptors are very, very important, as if you still remember, we said that most of the drugs have to work through receptors. So what exactly do these receptors do? One is that they're used, or they help in propagation of what we call regulatory signals from outside to the inside of the cell. Yeah. So in other words, once a drug binds, remember for those that drug for those where the drug binds outside, but then the effector or the effect has to be seen within the cell. So that basically means that as it binds, then signals that are transduced or are transmitted from the outside to the inside, where we are going to have the effect. So that is one property. They also do amplify signals. So in other words, they help make the signals and even the messages larger, yeah, as they try to work. Yeah, they also integrate various extracellular and intracellular regulatory signals. So in other words, they coordinate the communication between the outside and the inside of the cell as far as transmission signals are concerned. And then they help to adapt to what we call short-term and long-term changes in the regulatory milieu or environment, and as well maintain homeostasis. To explain more on this point, remember we said that most of these receptors are actually proteins, yeah? And if you still remember, we talked about the effect of tolerance and desensitization, if you remember that very well. Sometimes you find receptors being, reducing, yeah, like example on the cell surface membrane, and sometimes you find them, increasing in number, what we refer to as upward regulation. And so in that effect, they help to regulate, yeah, the environment, and as a result, maintain what we refer to as homeostasis. Now, those are the functions of receptors. Now, for any drug, as I said, to work, it has to work with receptors, and so it has to bind to that receptor, and what we refer to as the ligand. In this particular context, the ligand is the drug, and then the ligand receptor complex. Yeah. So as I said earlier on, the ligand has to be specific to the receptor. So in other words, it's like the lock and key in enzymes, whereby the drug has to bind to that at a specific site to that receptor, yeah, enhancing its activity, and we are going to see that some drugs have a more binding to the receptors, what we actually refer to as affinity. Yeah. So affinity is the ability to bind, yeah, to a receptor, and so some drugs have a more binding ability to that particular receptor compared to others. And so once a drug binds to a receptor, that is what we refer to as affinity. And so if you have two drugs, one that has a higher affinity to the drug will bind more. Yeah, will bind more to the drug, and so it will end up displacing one that has a lower affinity to this drug, rather to this receptor. We also talked about drugs that do not necessarily work through receptors. We gave examples like antacids, which basically neutralize, like for example aluminium hydroxide or magnesium hydroxide. These just end up neutralizing the acid in the stomach, and so they do not necessarily need to work through receptors. We have other examples like mannitol, cholesterol binding agents that are basically used in hyperlipidemia. Iron chelators, like for example, if you have iron toxicity, they usually give you a drug called deferoxamine. That's basically an iron chelator. It only binds to iron, and so does not necessarily need to work through receptors. And we also have some general anesthetics that basically do not work through receptors. Now, when a ligand binds to a receptor, we have what we call bonds. Bonds are formed, yeah? And they are basically three particular types of bonds that are formed when a receptor binds to the drug, yeah? We have what we call covalent bonds, electrostatic bonds, and hydrophobic bonds. Now, covalent bonds are usually stronger and in most cases irreversible. Remember, for a drug to bind to a receptor, usually the binding is reversible. So in other words, it can detach. However, with covalent bonds, this drug binds permanently and for the life of that receptor. Yeah? So they are strong and not irreversible. We also have what we refer to as electrostatic bonds. These are usually weaker than the covalent bonds and often more common and even reversible. But even more preferably are the hydrophobic bonds, which are the weakest and probably the most important in the interactions of what we call the lipid-soluble drugs in the hydrophobic pockets of these receptors. Now, as I said earlier on, these are the bonds, yeah, that are very, very important. And as we study the drug, we shall see some of the bonds that are formed where. Yeah, like for example, we have cholinesterase inhibitors in the organophosphates. These basically covalently bind to their receptors, and so once they bind, they do not leave. Yeah, that is what we mean by irreversible. And so the receptor has to die off. Yeah, for this drug to actually also be able to get to be gotten rid of from the body. So those are the bonds, and so when they bind, they form those particular bonds. Now, let's talk about lastly what we refer to as the properties of receptors. And we said earlier on that receptors are saturable. So in other words, when a receptor keeps on binding drugs, keeps on binding a particular ligand, a time reaches when it can no longer bind. Yeah, that is what we mean by saturability. A time reaches when the ligand, when the receptor can no longer bind to the ligand, and so it is said to be saturated. Now, the other property that we kept on mentioning is specificity, whereby we said that these drugs or these receptors act like enzymes, where we have what we call a lock and key. Yeah, if that drug is not structurally, complement to the receptor, then it will not be able to bind it. Yeah, and then lastly, the other property is what we call reversibility, whereby the drug should be able to bind to a receptor and then dissociate. Yeah, in its non-metabolized form. Now, most drugs actually, or most receptors, bind reversibly to the drugs. Yeah, and so those are what we refer to as the properties of receptors. Now, when we come back, we shall talk about how actually these receptors work and what are the different families of receptors. Thank you.